together with my colleague Michał Markowski, we head up the Polish Studies program at UIC. And it is our great pleasure to introduce our three distinguished panelists to you tonight. First, a word about the topic. I think some of you know something already about this. We know that in 1989, Poland collapsed, communism collapsed. Poland collapsed for a few months there, Poland itself was collapsing. Communism fell in Poland, and with it, the political system and the economic system, of course, were transformed. We know a lot about those transitions. They've been studied and talked about and debated for the last 20-some years. But we think less about the transition in information flow and the ways in which scholars practice their trade within Poland and about Poland. But those of us who conducted research there before 1989 remember having trouble gaining access to archives, remember not being able to speak to certain scholars, remember that many of our colleagues had secret police files kept on them because they were speaking to the wrong people about the wrong things. So access to information, travel, restrictions on what you could write about and what you could say about it, interpretations, all of those things were part of writing history under communism. And yet, in Poland, scholars managed to produce some very fine history. And so what our three contestants, our three panelists this evening will be discussing is how was it possible to produce scholarship, good scholarship under communist times? What kinds of clever ways did people navigate that system? What topics were forbidden? Which ones did they have to sort of be a little bit more careful about? And then what does change? What changes after '89 and what's the comparison before and after? Both in terms of how we were able to function as scholars and how we, as people reading the histories of these times, should understand what was produced at that time, right? Because those of us who do historical work read materials, read monographs and studies that are produced in the post-war period, and they offer us much, but they have to be read in a certain way, right? So without further ado, let me introduce our three panelists, and then we'll move on. Professor Robert Frost is here partially because he organized a wonderful conference on unions coming up at Newberry in the next couple of days, and he's loaned himself to us for this evening with his two colleagues. He is Burnett Fletcher Chair in History at the University of Aberdeen in Scotland. He has studied at the University of St. Andrews and at Jagiellonian University for how long were you there? For a year or two?
2 years.
Okay, so he has on-the-ground experience, but as a Westerner, which I think makes a difference. There's a contrast here. And then later at the University of London. He has published extremely widely, I have pages and pages from his CV, on the history of primarily the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and especially on the history of warfare in Eastern Europe. He is currently hard at work on a multi-volume project on the history of the Polish-Lithuanian Union. And I believe the first volume has just been finished? Or the second? The whole thing is finished?
No, the first
volume is finished, which is why he was released to come to America. I think that was contingent. Professor Jola Hołęska-Mika teaches. She specializes in the history of Mazovia and in the history of Polish parliamentary system. She was, to some extent, trained within Poland under the communist system, having obtained her doctorate soon after communism fell there. And she was also working at the History Institute at the University of Warsaw for about 10 years. She publishes on Mazovian history and the history of the Polish People's Republic, both within Poland and outside. Dr. Karol Mazur is a specialist in Ruthenian territories in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. He is head of the didactic section of the Museum of the Warsaw Uprising. He lectures regularly to the younger generation about the Warsaw Rising. He's been recently organizing a project called Opowiem Ci o Wolnej Polsce, which is a series of meetings between youth and older generations who were witnesses to history. So I welcome our panelists. We'll begin with Robert, who will speak for a while, and then his colleagues will chime in, after which I welcome all of you to submit your questions and comments and personal reflections, and then we will all turn around and return to the bar.
Well, thank you very much, Keely, for that generous introduction. I'm delighted to be here. I'd like to thank UIC for sponsoring this event when I originally a year ago said I was coming to Chicago to do a conference, that I was going to invite 2 Polish scholars, and why didn't we have an event? I rather thought perhaps we might end up in a seminar room at UIC with 5 people, but I didn't expect a reception and wine and whiskey and heaven knows what else. So I'm very grateful. I'm very grateful, of course, to the Chopin Theatre for proving such wonderful hosts. I had not realized that it was something like certain places I remember from Krakow in the early 1980s. And I hope tonight will be a rather informal occasion in which we can talk and discuss, because what I want to do now is really offer you some personal reflections. As Keeley said, I'm a historian of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. I stop around, well, I really feel comfortable up to about 1720, and then it all gets a bit hazy. So a few years back, a journalist from Sky Television phoned me up in London and said, "Would you like to comment on the Polish elections?" And he was a little surprised when I said, "What elections?" And then I realized what he meant. I said, no, I know nothing about the elections currently going on in Poland, but I could tell you about the elections to the Sejm of 1658 if you were really interested.
And was he?
No. So I do not study the Polish People's Republic. I lived there for 2 years. And part of what I want to do today is talk about what it was like to do historical research there and how historians coped under communism. And part of what I wanted to do, and this was where Polish studies here came to my mind, was when I get people coming to me and starting a doctorate on Polish history, the first task I set them is to write a bibliographical, and it's the most boring thing you can do. You've got to go through all the books that are written on it and say what you think about them. It's really designed to answer the so what question. Why would anybody want to know about this, and why are you doing it? What have people done before? And invariably, especially in Britain, children of Polish emigres who come and turn up and want to write, unfortunately they're the only ones who have the language and can do it, and they turn up. And the first piece I get basically says about every historian who published in the Polish People's Republic, these people are Marxists and can be disregarded. And I think, well, wait a minute, I know some of these people, and Marxists they certainly aren't. So what I'm going to talk about just briefly is to say, and I hope a little provocatively so that we can have a discussion, about writing in the Polish People's Republic and how historians, and I want to stress this at the start, how many historians were able in the Polish People's Republic to keep the values of the historical profession alive and keep their dignity as historians. So that my impression is that Polish historical scholarship in 1989 was in a far better condition than scholarship in the other communist countries. So I'm sorry to, in the Chopin Theatre, to start with a slide with Joseph Stalin on it. But I think it illustrates something, a line that was made by, in the wonderful television program, I don't know if it was ever shown in the States, An Englishman Abroad, which is about Guy Burgess in exile in Moscow. And it's a true incident. Coral Brown was an actress playing Shakespeare in Moscow, and she turned up. Guy Burgess came in and he wanted to order suits from Savile Row, and he moaned about everything he missed about England. Well, you should have thought about that when you decided to spy for the Russians. But he made this wonderful remark about how the comrades don't have a sense of irony. I think you can see that from this opening poster. If Stalin is the standard of humanity, then we wouldn't be here by now, I would reckon. Anyway, that was the shadow that hung over Polish historical writing for 40-odd years. Now, of course, scholarship was accorded a great position in the socialist communist project. We're building our new culture. Academics were meant to line up and get behind this great project. So I'd like to start with a critique, a devastating critique of the writing of history in the Polish People's Republic. Now, well, I don't know if you can all see the English translation, so I'll read my English translation. The unfortunate attempt to turn the discipline of history into a tool of propaganda had a terrible effect upon the development of historical research. Okay? Research into contemporary history was treated exclusively as a domain of interest for historians linked to the party apparatus. This led to the confinement of research within the framework of the history of the workers' movement and its treatment in the light of the political requirements of the moment. here we reach the peroration, the level of instruction suffered a noticeable fall in quality, and the application of Marxist methodology, often beaten into audiences by partially trained lecturers, still wet behind the ears, led to an unheard of vulgarization of Marxism. Now, who wrote this? Who said this? Could have been one of my students, all these damn Marxists. This was a speech by Tadeusz Manteuffel at the 8th Universal Congress of Historians of Polish Historians, held in Krakow. He made the speech on the 14th of September 1958. Stalin was 5 years in his grave. This man, Tadeusz Manteuffel, died in 1970. He was president of the Polish Historical Society from 1950 to 1953, in the years of Stalinism. He was dean and prorector of the University of Warsaw. In 1951, with she's disappeared. What was her name? Zhanna Kozianowa. I don't know where that disappeared to. He declared that historians should play an important role in the ideological offensive mounted by socialism in Poland. So this is no emigre, this is no exile complaining about the standard of historical scholarship in Poland. This is a man at the peak of the historical recession. This speech, if you go and look at the edited collection of the lectures given at the 8th Zjazd, you will not find this speech. It only was published years later. The censor, of course, cut it out. Now, there he is. This is I love a country that puts historians on postage stamps. In Britain, you only get the Queen and these days meretricious pop stars. But a country that puts historians on stamps has cultural values. Now, Zhanna Kormanova was, of course, one of the party historians. She was a school teacher and a lifelong communist. She escaped to Stalingrad in 1939. Most Polish communists went the other way. They decided that they'd rather go with the devil they didn't know than the devil they knew only too well, since most of them had been, many of their comrades had been executed by Stalin in the late 1930s. She took her habilitatia in 1947, and she was the founder of the Marxist Circle of Historians at the second Zjazd of the Polish Workers' Party, United Polish Workers' Party, in 1948. So she was very much part of the communist historical establishment. I just thought I'd illustrate this with some of those wonderful propaganda posters. Yeah, it looks rather uncomfortable in this one, I think. Friendship of, well, we won't go into Polish-Soviet friendship. Like Natalia Gąsiorowska, who died in 1964. These were, now notice that these are women, and I'll come back to that in a minute. She was really the Nestor of Polish communist historians. She joined the party in 1918. She came from a poor Szlachta background. She was educated, it can't be that poor, because she was educated in Heidelberg, Paris, Lwów, and Hamburg. She joined the Communist Party in 1918, and she held as a docent cathedra of social and economic history in the University of Warsaw between 1934 and 1939. And she was the president of the Polish Historical Society immediately after Manteuffel, 1953 to 1956. And like another woman, Selina Bobinska, who was, in my day in Krakow, stories were told about her. They were legion, about how she had come in with her communist views and tried to order people around. Note that they're all women. Now, I suspect there may be something in this that women were excluded from the profession in the 1930s. It was very, it's hard even today for women to rise to the top of the historical profession in Poland for structural reasons I might say something about later on. But in the 1930s, perhaps becoming a radical historian outside the establishment was something that they were attracted to. But Manteuffel was very different to these people. Manteuffel had lost a hand fighting, his right hand fighting to defend Warsaw in 1920. He'd served in the Home Army during the Polish-Soviet War. During the Second World War. He was not a member of the party, but he was one of those in the Polish historical profession who played what I would say was a key role after the war. When the communists came in, there was a big dilemma. What do you do? Do you accept this? Do you not? Do you work with them? Now, the first thing that the Polish Historical Society did after the war was they elected Władysław Konopczyński as their president. Now, that was not a good move. Konopczynski had been associated with Dmowski. He was a man of the right. He was not a man with whom the communists could work. And they insisted that the headquarters of the Towarzystwo stayed in Kraków. Big disaster. The party wanted it in Warsaw. And in the late 1940s and the early 1950s, there was a lot of politicking going on around this. And Manteuffel came in and said, look, we've got to work with the party, you know, we've got to do what we can. And so historians did. But in so doing, I would suggest this evening, they did so in order to try and help preserve the values of historical scholarship that they had imbibed before the war, and to keep alive true scholarship. And I'll say a little bit about that struggle before we get down to the discussion. This was vital, because this didn't happen elsewhere. One of the problems that the communists faced in coming in and trying to make history this part of the party's struggle was, where did you get your historians? There were very, very few, like Gąsiorowska, who were convinced communists. Now, there were quite a lot of young, particularly young Polish historians, who were interested in Marxist ideas and interested in the ideas of the left. Now, this was nothing unusual. Marxist ideas were prevalent in the historical profession right across Europe in the period before the Second World War, and many socialist historians, of course, not communists, were interested in Marxist ideas. Indeed, that survived in many Western European universities and American universities deep into the 1970s and beyond. When I was an undergraduate in Scotland in the late 1970s, essentially Marxist or Marxism ideas were, if not the mainstream, not in the full version, but the idea that social and economic causes were the fundamental driving forces of history. Very few people challenged that. We did lots of courses in economic history, and this was thought to be important. And there were many Marxists. Actually, I suspect there were far more Marxists on the faculty, history faculties in Princeton, Yale, Oxford, Cambridge, and elsewhere than there were actually in Poland, in the Polish People's Republic. But here the structure of the historical profession is important, because Poland has the German system. You do your doctorate, which is a slightly, on the whole, not quite as full a piece of work as an Anglo-Saxon doctorate, and correct me if I'm wrong. And then you've got to go through this, I think, slightly humiliating system of doing your habilitacja, your second doctorate, which you finish when you're in your late 30s or early 40s. And that merely qualifies you to be considered for a chair. And if you don't get a chair, I have German friends who reach their early 40s and the chairs have all closed down. And, you know, I don't know how they get by under European labour law, which makes it impossible to sack people. But there you go, you know, you can be in your early 40s, you produce 2 huge books that nobody will read, and you don't get your chair. What do? You're out. But that structure, I think, helped preserve the values of scholarship. Because what did the communists have? They had people like Manteuffel who were willing to work with them. But they were the men who'd been trained, and they were mostly men, who'd been trained in the system before 1939. They'd done their doctorates, they'd got their chairs, and they had the position of power. And long afterwards, in the early 1990s, when I went to give a seminar paper in Kraków, at a seminar run by Józef Gierowski, who was a distinguished historian of the Saxon period, who had been my opiekun when I was doing my doctoral research in Poland. He said, yes, he said, the key thing was that the scholars kept control of the habilitacja. And that was the way they kept the party hacks out. Party hacks could become docents. And if you see in the sort of faculty things of Polish universities in that period, somebody was a docent and never rose to be a professor, you think, oh, well, that's a party person. Because and after 1990, they abolished the title of docent immediately. Germans still have it, but not the Poles anymore, I think I'm correct in saying. So the problem was that they had, and my students are right, up to a point, you had to play the game. But a lot of the time, what historians did was go through a sort of scheme of passive resistance. if you read, and I would not wish this on anybody actually, if you read the minutes and it's one of the reasons I don't study communist Poland, to read all these committee meeting minutes by communists, and there's lots of guff given out by Manteuffel and people about building socialism and didactic strategies for this and that. And then you look at the history they write, and yes, there was a brief period in the I'm just checking to see what I've got, a brief period in the 1950s when there was particular pressure to write in a sort of Stalinist mode, and some of the writing in that period is quite hard to get through. But after that, after the thaw, Manteuffel's speech in 1958 was actually, there were a few past issues that he was dealing with. The weakness of contemporary history. That's because nobody who was any good wanted to study the history of the 20th century, Second World War, and particularly not the history of the Communist Party, because why would you? That was where the real restrictions were. Now, all the great, and some of them are great historians, who preserved Polish history, as I've suggested, most of them, like Manteuffel himself, were medievalists or early modernists. They dealt with the period before the partitions. And there, you had much more scope. You could let the party's political group of historians write the history of the Communist Party. Who was interested in that? But you could get on and write the history of the medieval period, of the early modern period, and increasingly, as you go through the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s, you see sort of communist, you no longer have to quote Engels on the first page and Lenin on the first page and get them out of the way. You don't even have to quote them at all. Now, up to a point, many of the historians who did this were, part of the communist agenda was popular. The communists very much played, of course, on the question of the western borders of Poland, that communism had restored these lands to Poland and produced, this is a wonderful map from the Historical Atlas that suggests that the borders of the Polish People's Republic, what's happened here? Yeah. Oh, no, of course, it's a television screen, so my pointer doesn't work. But the western borders of the Polish People's Republic are nearly the same as the medieval borders of Poland, and that this eastern stuff was all a lot of nonsense that should have been forgotten. Of course, they played Grunwald, Tannenberg, keeping back the German hordes, and that played well, and a lot of research was undertaken into this. And there was the disaster of the war, and there was a certain amount you could do with that. I like this, but I don't put this poster up because I like the way in which the Polish People's Republic only blamed the English. We Scots quite like that. It wasn't our fault. It was the fault of the English. Now, what was possible, I would like to illustrate with one example that has particularly struck me. Because Andrzej Wyczański, who was a historian of a topic that the communists were very interested in. They were very interested in peasants and workers. There were a lot more peasants in Poland than there were workers. So you study the history of the peasantry, and that's great because Marxist history says you must study the history of the feudal system and the oppression of the peasantry, and so on and so forth. And they produced lots of maps with little flames on to show where peasant rebellions had taken place. And this was partly to show the corruption of the Szlachta period and how the nobility were all terrible. Now, in a sense, this tapped into what had been a long trope of Polish history, because from the 19th century, from the school of Krakow pessimists launched by Michał Bobrzyński, historians have been arguing for years that the partitions were the fault of the system, that we can't blame the Prussians and the Russians and the Austrians, we've got to blame ourselves. And the Szlachta had behaved abominably. They treated the peasantry abominably, and so on. So this was nothing new. So you could write about the peasantry within this particular set of ideas, and also, writing about the peasantry, you could adopt West European ideas and attitudes. There was a school of historians in France, the Annalistes, who studied the peasantry and nothing else, or almost nothing else, and wrote huge books about it, but not in a Marxist framework. And by the 1970s and 1980s, people like Vachansky are essentially writing Annalist history, and then they say, oh, well, we're writing about peasants. You like us writing about peasants, that's part of the historical mission of the communist period. But Vachansky, one of the things the communists did, which was terrific, was they said, right, we've got to publish the peasantry, we've got to produce the materials on which we can do it. So they insisted that the Kartoteka Wiejska, a card index file for Polish villages, was drawn up in every local archive. And they went through all the court record books. Anybody who's worked on Polish history of that period will tell you the court record books are a complete mess, because you come in, you have a case in the court record books, and you write down the case. There's no system. It's impossible to find anything. You go out and you read the records. You can be lost for years in there and find nothing that you're looking for. This index gives you the material to work with. And what did Vachansky do? He published a book on the Folwark, on the introduction of the manorial economy, the introduction of serfdom in Poland, you know, that terrible exploitation of the peasantry. Now, this is published in 1960. And what does he say? He says, we don't know anything about the economic condition of the peasantry, so I am going to study that. He said, this is 1960. I am not interested in other factors such as, you know, non-economic factors. The class struggle, he says, I'm not going to write about the class struggle because I don't find it in my sources. The first time I read that, I thought, this is published in 1960. This is incredible. Because I can tell you, having read a lot of stuff produced by Soviet and East German scholars in the same period, you would never have got anything like that. In 1960, you wouldn't have got that in 1989 from Soviet scholars, who just went away and wrote down facts, and that was their way of avoiding it. And then in 1978, he published a wonderful article saying, was life so bad for peasants in the 16th century? And he came to the conclusion that, actually, no, it wasn't. Many of them were actually quite wealthy. They rather liked paying labor rent because it was less onerous than paying money in cash. Because the rich peasants didn't do the labor rent themselves, they sent somebody else, or they paid somebody else to do it. And so this has laid the foundations for what I think is a complete transformation of our understanding in the 20 years, 25 years since the fall of communism, of the Polish village in the early medieval and early modern period. They're far ahead of work that's been done in Germany and especially in Russia, where the old Marxist ideas still survive. I put this poster up because just I think if you're putting up, I wish I'd found this serving woman in a shop when I lived in Poland in the early 1980s. We serve people pleasantly and quickly with a smile on our face. By this period, very few people believe in the system. They've got to live with it. And as Keeley pointed out, there were still constraints. Writing about Polish-Russian relations was difficult. You couldn't get to Eastern archives. You couldn't, or if you did, you were told what documents you could read. That's why, to use an old joke that you all know, why do we call them our brothers in socialism? Because you choose your relatives, you choose your friends, but you're stuck with your relations. And the communists tried throughout the period to use the history. Now, here's the Solidarity generation, the heroes of the Solidarity generation associated with Targowica. But this propaganda doesn't work. Nobody takes this seriously by 1980-81. The communists have lost the battle by this period, I would suggest. The values of historical scholarship have been kept alive. I want to end with just, I haven't said anything much about the problems and the tasks that lie ahead for Polish history, and of course, modern history is one of those difficult areas because it was ignored by the best scholars in the communist period. You couldn't get into the archives, the party would control you, what was the point? But I think quite a lot of interesting things historically are going on in Poland. One of the things that Stanisław Herbst did when he was secretary of the Polish Historical Society was he insisted that you set up local branches who studied local history. That was to avoid the centralist idea. And he said, you know, we're taking the message out, the didactic message out into the provinces so that we can bring them on board for socialism. And that party said, oh, well, that's great then. But local branches of the Polish Historical Society kept going and kept doing local research. And these days, some of the results, to my mind, are quite interesting. There has been a return in Poland, to my mind, to the sort of local patriotism and focus on the locality, which to my mind was what Poland was like before the partitions. Your principal loyalty often was to your province, your województwo, rather than perhaps the centre. I was astonished when I went to the dress rehearsal for the reenactment of the Battle of Tannenberg in Grunwald in 1410, to read the Gazeta Ostrucka. Nasi rycerze też poszli pod Grunwald. I thought, what? Our knights? This is local patriotism in Polish Prussia these days. These are our boys, they're going off to fight. W czwartek rano załoga rycerska naszego zamku wyruszyła pod Grunwald, by stoczyć śmiertelny bój z wojskami polsko-litewskimi. Bo tu stąd na zacięty bój pod Grunwaldem wyruszali krzyżacy. And we live in this place, and our boys, I thought, this is astonishing, this local patriotism. And one of the great achievements of Polish historical scholarship in the communist period was to write dispassionately about the history of the recovered lands. I go to Torun a lot, and the history of Polish Royal Prussia is undertaken, it's got away from that dreadful nationalist stuff that you had in 1939 and before that of Polish-German relations, and it has laid the foundations for a much stronger and better relationship with German historical scholarship, which has also got away from the shibboleths of the past. And this, to my mind, is very encouraging. And it's a reason why I would say that Polish historical scholarship is flourishing today, but it's because of the battles that were won in the communist period, and particularly in the 1950s, when times were hard. And at that point, I will stop and throw the floor open to Jola and Karol. Jola knows quite a lot about textbooks because she's been involved in cleaning up those textbooks that were drawn up. That was one of the problems. That required a lot of clearing up. And Karol can talk about a bit about the problems of modern history, which is still difficult. But Jola, do you want to start?
Oh no. Thank you very much. Sorry for our English, because you know it isn't our native language, so sometimes I will support with Polish if you don't mind.
Do you want to sit on stage maybe so we can see you project?
No.
Come into the spotlight. Go on.
You're welcome to sit if that would be.
Or sit. I'll
So I you know what I should add to this speech, because you know I graduated from Warsaw University in the 1980s, so it was under the communist. It was during the communist era, and what can be surprising that my tutor was Jarema Maciszewski, a very prominent. You know, he was one of the most important VIPs in the Communist Party, because he was in charge of science and education. But you know, what should be added, that he derives from noble families, and his father was a member of Piłsudczycy. He was Vice Minister of Education. As far as I remember, it was in the late 30s. I'm not so sure. So maybe because it was due to his origins, he was very interested in the political culture, and he was focused on political culture of the nobility. What was really surprising, because in fact he, a very dedicated member of the Communist Party, he focused not in his, you know, academic research, not on economy or something like that, but on the political culture of the nobility. So in fact, he wrote a lot about local assemblies, political participation culture, and so on. What was really surprising. But I think that he was able to write and tell many, you know, about this topic in superlatives, because he was a member of Communist Party. So in fact, it was very funny, because maybe he was not maybe the only one, but it was his field, and none of those, parties' authorities could interfere in his individual, in his personal research. So maybe because of this, our seminar was to some extent covered, was to some extent under his protection, and because of that, as far as I remember, we constituted our seminar. We constituted a body of about 15, and we had only one party member among us. What was also very surprising at that moment, and it was also because he was scientific pupil, scientific student of Władysław Czapliński. So maybe because of that, I think that in fact it was due to his home education, his noble family tradition, because he spent his childhood in Kresy. It was when now Ukraine is. So maybe this is why we were under his shield. And because of that, I could also develop my research on Szlachta, and we could develop this research in favor of Szlachta nobility culture. Because as Robert said, what was promoted in early modern history, the history of economy, and only one vision of the reasons why Poland collapsed. So we, in our seminar, we to some extent, not maybe exaggerated, but we all were strongly in favor of this participative citizenship, civic culture. So what is really, our contribution to this preservation of true scholarship, as Robert described it, was that we, in fact, considered ourselves as, keepers of old values. And this is why, for example, in my text, and also in my books, and also in my lectures, which I have been giving for 30 years for my students, there are a lot of about civic values, about historical tradition, about patriotism, in fact, which we could observe in 17th and 16th century Polish-Lithuanian common. However, in the late 60s and early 80s, it was difficult to study systematically the history of Lithuania, because it was related to the very difficult access to Soviet archives, as Robert said. But if you decided to study the Kingdom of Poland, the Poland, Central Poland, in fact, you didn't have any reservation, any restrictions, but you could have if you promote, for example, Catholic values. Because also, if you look through the bibliography, the list of works which were published during this era, what can strike you that how many works were against, for example, Jesuits, against Catholicism, against the church. So usually the history of church was, described as the history of something which was always conservative, which was always primarily connected and related to Roma, not to Poland. And also in our seminar, we tried, and I think that we did it, to rethink this model. And I think that also, for example, the works of our colleagues, as now Professor Dzięgielewski also, we have our contribution, our PRL contribution, because we were born, we were raised, we were taught, we, received our education then, but we have never been member of any party, a communist or something, something like that. I think that even now we can read our text with no, how to express, shame. We can stand for our thesis, and also what's maybe that we have no records, our personal records, because we didn't cross the border. We didn't cross the border. We decided to focus on the history of Poland, not to, for example, comparative studies, because now I'm doing comparative studies, comparing Polish, English Parliament and so on, so on. Then I decided not to, because if I had to do it, I had to go, I had to ask for passport, I had to, pass through all these interrogations and so on, so on. And also our tutor, Professor Baciszewski, recommended us very strongly, do not cross the border, but keep your eye on, for example, Mazovia, as I did. Keep an eye. And now I understand this. At that moment, I was a little bit astonished. Okay, you have a lot of possibilities, a lot of opportunities. Send me somewhere, to England, to France, but now I really, really thank him not to do it. So thank you very much, and if you have any question, it will be my pleasure to answer. I can also tell something about our now problems with students or something like that.
Said, I would like to say a couple of words about my institution, because I work in Warsaw Rising Museum, and about modern history. Of course, I deal with early modern history as a scientist. So when I started my study in the 90s, of course the situation was different if you compare with the communist time. Especially because I started to deal with Ukrainian history, Ruthenia region in Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, because I got free access to Ukrainian archives. There is a big difference. So I got opportunity to visit Kiev and Lviv, and I used to work in this archive, so I could prepare my PhD dissertation about the Ukrainian local nobility assemblies in this time. So I'm deeply interested in the process of integration between Poland and Ruthenian lands during the early modern period. But let's back to my institution. So, as Robert mentioned, so during the communist time it was very hard to teach, to research modern history, because the best historians escaped in medieval history, in early modern history. So because, as you know, modern history was deeply under communist propaganda. But also it was big challenge after the communist regime had collapsed in Poland, how to teach, how to show, how to present modern history. Yeah, because of course we are free. So especially not only in Polish historiography, but also in schools, and also for all public opinion, how to present modern history, because modern history, as you know, is very important to create historical, political consciousness. So in 90s, of course, it was period of transformation. So especially when post-communism gained government in Poland, there is main idea, it's better to forget about past, about the history. This is very dangerous. So let's say about presence, let's look to future. It's a good idea, the big idea of Aleksander Kwaśniewski, yeah, when he was elected in 1995. His good idea, main idea was let's forget about past, let's look future. So of course I raised in the strong opposition to this approach. So we created a new approach. We created a new institution. Also rising was in 2004, very late. So communism collapsed in '98. So it was over 10 years lasted when we create a new institution, very modern museum. But of course, I think that when we create and we made our institution, there's the crucial point in teaching history, especially modern history, and we want to encourage especially young people to build history, to teach, to learn history. Of course, we used multimedia installation, so especially that when we think how to build the exhibition, some of my colleagues visited the Holocaust Museum in Washington, and one of this guy who worked there say you must use language of young people. So let's connect MTV with CNN and create a new exhibition. Of course, there's also only didactic aid. I treat our exhibition, modern exhibition, of course, as a teaching aid. Very good to show modern history. Of course, as you know, Warsaw Rising is very important event in our history, very controversial, but very deeply rooted in historical consciousness, especially of Warsaw inhabitants. Warsaw, but not only Warsaw. I think personally, I am very because my family fought in Warsaw Rising. The sisters of my grandmother. I am a relative of Vice Prime Minister of Polish government in exile, Jankowski. So of course, it's a very important event to me. And we wanted to show the Warsaw Uprising in very broad context, not only as a military event. Another uprising in Polish history failed, yeah, but we want to show this event as an experience of totalitarian systems. So we think that it's very important, not only for us, Poles, but also for all Europe, even all world, how totalitarian systems acted. And through the uprising, it's very easy to show the nature of these totalitarian systems. As you know, we fought against, of course, fascism with Germans, but Soviets led Germans to put down the uprising. Yeah, so it was easy to show how the nature of the totalitarian systems in this time. It is one of our most messages we want to share with our visitors. And the second one, especially we directed to young Polish people, we want to show the uprising as a time that Polish state existed. For over 2 months, in Warsaw was independent Poland. And the best symbol of this Polish statehood is printing shop. We accounted over 150 titles of newspapers printed during the uprising. During 2 months, titles, no examples. This is a big phenomenon. These people lived in very cruel and very difficult conditions, but they had time to share with ideas, to discuss the future political system of Poland. This big message to young people that, of course, we underline that all political options received papers to print the ideas. So there was democratic, pluralistic state during the uprising. It's a very important message to our young people. Thank you very much.
Shall we bring the chairs?
Right, so maybe we can.
We can all assemble
ask
back
you-
on the stage and have a discussion of this.
Could I start you off right while you're?
Do you want to? There's 4 chairs.
No.
coming.
I don't know that I have anything to add, but I want to ask you to think a little bit about the slightly more modern period of Polish history, which I know is painful for you to have to do because it's not your field, but bear with me for a moment. In the last several years, there have been a lot of historical monographs that have come out on the history of borderlands all over Eastern Europe. The national indifference, sort of combined communities that are linguistically complex. And I'm wondering, the books I'm referring to are mostly written by Westerners, but it seems to me that that's actually a new iteration that takes us beyond what you're suggesting, and what you all were suggesting is that in communist times, it was completely appropriate to do research on Polish issues, but to go to Lithuania, to go to Ukraine, to go to the Soviet Union, and do research, it was difficult to do borderland cuspish work. So one understands why within Poland, people didn't do that work, it was too difficult to get access to the archives. But why do you think that foreigners didn't?
Well,
Were we following the hint, following the lead of our Polish colleagues?
I can tell you why, because often they weren't allowed to. When I started my PhD in London under Norman Davis in 1981, I had another PhD student started with me, who never, I think, finished in the end. But he was doing the medieval settlement, German settlement in Poland, particularly of monastic houses, how German monks were sort of planted in the Polish lands. And key sources for this were in Prague. So he wrote a big podanie applied to go to Prague to look at these sources, and he got the majestic reply, "This topic is not of interest to the Czechoslovak People's Republic. Permission refused." And that was how it was. So the way you couldn't, if you wanted to study Polish things and use archives, as a Westerner you wouldn't get permission because you had to go through the official channels, and permission denied. But there was a very distinguished school of Polish historians of Lithuania and of the Ukrainian territories that did write under communism, and some of them did actually get to the archives and had ways of finding out what was there and getting access to it, usually by corrupting the archivists. In fact, some of you may know the work of Andrzej Komiński at Georgetown, who went to the ends of marrying the daughter of the head of the archive in Moscow, which means that he wrote this remarkable book on the Confederation of Sandomierz, where the criticism of it in Poland, because Andrzej then had to leave to go to the States, was that while Professor Komiński knows the Russian sources very well, he does not know the Polish sources. He's not done his Polish archival work. So, he fell between that stool.
Okay.
So it was possible, and usually a large bottle of vodka and discussions in small places.
I usually brought coffee to
Yeah,
them.
yeah,
I
well,
don't know about you.
yeah. But there were ways,
Yeah.
and scholars such as Andrzej Rakuba or Lewicz in the communist period did manage somehow to go to our brothers in socialism and come back with materials. They often knew stuff that was there that they couldn't access until after 1980.
But what was really forbidden and what was really difficult, it was to provide, research on 18th century Poland.
Yeah.
Because, it was, in fact, almost all materials were in Petersburg and Moscow.
Yes.
And it was, related to the vision of Russian imperial policy. So they let you go to Lithuania, to Vilnius, because it was an element of Soviet, national policy inside the Soviet Union. So they, because it was in their goal to provide Caesarean policy, dzielej rządź, rule and
Divide and
Divide and
rule.
rule.
yeah, of course. And it was, so they let you go, for example, to Vilnius,
Okay.
but not to Petersburg,
Yeah.
because it could create, for example, bad vision of Katrina the Great,
Oh,
or
yeah.
something like that.
There was
Really?
also a way of writing about the history of the Ukrainian lands and the Khmelnytsky Rising. Now, it's quite clear that the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth went wrong in the 17th century in the Ukrainian lands, and Polish historians have been writing about this for a long period. So as long as you said that, or talked about the ways in which, Szlachta policy in Ukraine was bad and the Cossacks were oppressed, you could actually go and do quite a lot more and find out more. And I think there's a tradition in Polish history of which was true of, I think, all the communist countries, of factographia. You couldn't actually say anything analytic because of all this communist nonsense. But what you could do was go and find out what happened. And a lot of Soviet scholars did that when they were studying the peasants. They didn't actually go off and say very much, but they went into great detail about all these estates and published reams of material, which now historians can use. I mean, if you look at Khrushchevsky, who wrote his history of Ukraine Rus, when he went back to the Soviet Union in the 1930s and wrote the last volumes of his great history of Ukraine Rus, the early volumes are full of value judgments and theories about the development. The last volumes are basically, he just puts documents on the page. Now that was great because some of those documents were going to burn in the Second World War. But he didn't actually hazard any judgments. He just said, here's the stuff, think for yourself. Because I can't do your thinking for you under present conditions. And I think there was a lot of that went on in TRL. People said, there was a sense when communism fell of people saying, we've wanted to say this for years, but now we can say it. Which was very exciting in that first couple of decades after 1990. I don't know, Carol, because your work, Carol's book on the Schlachter of Ukraine is terrific, and their assemblage and how they. One of the things that you talked about borderlands, because I didn't say anything about that, but one of the striking things since the fall of communism is the way in which gradually and slowly a sense of the history of, not of Poland,
The edges.
but of Poland, Lithuania and the whole Union state has emerged not just in Poland, and there were a lot of conferences around the time of the anniversary of the Union of Lublin. I went to one in Minsk, and it was very encouraging to see, because of course that was the other way of divide and rule, was Lithuanian historians were encouraged to take the Lithuanian nationalist views of the 1930s and say the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was a disaster for Lithuania. Ukraine took on Khrushchevsky, who also thought it was a disaster for Ukraine. And that was encouraged, just as the partitioning powers had encouraged exactly the same thing in the 19th century. But now the partitioning powers are gone, communism is gone, and gradually Lithuanians and Ukrainians, it's more difficult in Belarus, are beginning to come back and think, well, this is our common history. How do we put it back together again without this?
So we can share the heritage.
We can share this heritage, and it's very interesting. I was at a conference in Minsk in 2009 where there were Poles, Belarusians, Ukrainians, Lithuanians, and a couple of Russians. And everybody spoke their own language. The Poles spoke Polish, the Ukrainians spoke Ukrainian, the Belarusians spoke Belarusian. The Lithuanians didn't speak Lithuanian because who understands Lithuanian? They spoke either Polish or Russian. And everybody understood everybody except the Russians, who had to have things translated for them. And who, now the reverse problem is there, because there was a paper given by a Russian scholar on the partition period. And Andrzej Rachuba blew up. I was chairing the session, and I could see Andrzej Rachuba getting red in the face and blowing up. And I said, Andrzej. And Andrzej went into this diatribe. He said, you have not read any of the recent Polish literature. You have not been in Warsaw. The sources show that this was a provocation by Catherine the Great. And the poor guy just had to say, no, I haven't been to Warsaw and worked. You know, they don't come to Polish archives. They don't read Polish scholarship. That's not true of all Russian scholars. There are some very good Russian scholars who've begun to do that. But there's a sense that the problems of the partition period, the 19th century, have dissolved, and the problems of the communist period have dissolved. It's a very exciting period to be working on. As Yola said, in the communist period you had to work on the history of Poland, basically. But now it's become much easier, although some of the archives in the East are still
You could go
little
further,
Soviet.
you know, Robert, you could go further, but you know, it required special dedication to that particular topic and special concession, political concession. So if you if you didn't want to do it and to share this experience with KGB or something like that, so who cares in fact?
Marina, did you have a question?
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for this very interesting panel. And I have questions basically for maybe all panelists, and I have many. And my questions are basically inspired by my comparative experiences as a Russian scholar, being educated during Soviet times and being partially, of course, the result of the Soviet historiographic training. And this question that was asked at the beginning of the panel, why Polish historiography was better compared to other socialist historiographies, actually is a really interesting question. And I want to ask you, and maybe suggest a rather provocative thesis. But I think that all of you mentioned this in your presentations when you mentioned Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and the studies of it, and when you mentioned how scholars were encouraged to focus on Poland and things Polish during the Soviet time. So I think this history as a way of, as a kind of escape for nationalist sentiments played its role. And I think that the idea of our Poland and our history was actually formed during the Soviet time. So, and this is, in a way, probably an under-reflected outcome of the Soviet experience in Poland. But I think it's played its very important role. So compared to Soviet Union, you had this, attempt to use history as an escape, as a way to express your national sentiments. And history actually provided such an opportunity for scholars from Lithuania who did, their studies on Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And actually, they fought their little, wars with Polish colleagues. Obviously, they used this opportunity. You have many examples in Ukraine. You have many examples in Caucasus, in Tbilisi, Georgian historian. And also you have ethnography as the field where all future post-Soviet nationalist intellectuals were actually educated and came from. So my question basically is whether you would consider this element. You really don't have, and I think this somehow connects with Kelly's question about borderland studies. Here in the West, in the same period, nationalist paradigm was the dominant paradigm. So not just the problem with access to archives, but basically how we perceived history and what should be the subject of historical research mattered. And another thing is, and this is also kind of a question, how would you evaluate the role of a Polish diaspora as a sponsor and as a kind of context for the development of Polish studies in the West, and then in the post-Soviet situation in Poland, because Russia doesn't have a diaspora. So Soviet historians wanted to have a diaspora as everyone else. We wanted to be like everyone else. So the diaspora was found in this immigrant generation of Russians who left Russia after the revolution of 1917 and who settled in Europe and who, published this Russian nationalist, Eurasianist, proto-fascist, all kinds of texts, Marxist as well. So they became this diaspora, but they were not physically present. And even Putin, quoted from some proto-fascist intellectuals, not once in his speeches, but they were not there. While in case of Polish diaspora, Ukrainian diaspora, Lithuanian diaspora, you have this very influential force. So how would you evaluate their influence? My second question is about this leftist paradigm in Polish historiography. So again, I think about Soviet experience. So I would not really dismiss this influence of leftist ideas and leftist paradigm. And especially in Poland, where you have a very strong tradition of leftist thought and it's still alive, and you have the younger generation, critical politician, right? So people who invest into this project. So I think that even if you talk about this focus on the economic studies of peasantry, this is also an influence of Marxist paradigm. It's not maybe kind of Soviet Bolshevik, but this is again about this economic basis for as the most important historical factor that predetermines cultural development and social formations. So my question is whether in today's Poland there is an attempt to write a detailed, nuanced history of leftist paradigms and how they influenced historical mentality and historical writing during the Soviet time. And well,
let's give them a chance to respond.
Okay.
Lecture here.
No.
I think the Russian diaspora was internal. They were scattered across Russia. That's a very interesting set of questions. Where to begin? I would, just to take your last point first, I think yes. I mean, I think that was how a lot of them, you'll notice that one of the things that Manteuffel said was he complained in 1958 about the vulgarization of Marxism. He was basically saying Marxism is a perfectly valid and powerful intellectual tool for analyzing the past. And it's something I tell my students. I say, look, in the 19th century, if you were looking at the creation of a satisfactory paradigm for scientific history, Marxism is the best that we've got. And it really is a powerful tool. But there's sophisticated Marxism and there's vulgar Marxism. And he was saying, look, these party historians are just peddling vulgar Marxism. Now, the constraints in the Soviet Union were much greater. And, I have a great respect for a number of Soviet historians, given the conditions they were working under. And what I was trying to say in my talk was actually the constraints under which Polish historians were working in the PRL were much less, I think, on the whole. There was a brief period in the 1950s, but as that speech in 1958 demonstrates, they had a lot more latitude than I think Soviet historians have. I mean, Russian historians have made a great contribution. One of the greatest historians of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was Matvei Lubavsky, who was writing before the First World War. Now, he's a great historian of Poland-Lithuania. But that tradition died. And the Soviet Union had communism for 70 years. And Poland-Lithuania had it for 40 years. So, people who actually had... one thing I would like to do is write a study of historians, like you mentioned Władysław Czapliński. That was a man who had been a doctoral student of Konopczynski, who I mentioned at the start of my talk. And, a man of the right and a Catholic. After the war, he became, you could see that younger generation thinking, we have an opportunity here to get positions in academic life that we would never have got before the war because we're too young and so on. And he helped set up the University of Wrocław, engaged in that, and by the 1970s he was writing some tremendous stuff. His autobiography, Szkoła w Młodych Oczach, is a wonderful description of his experiences of remembering what happened when the partitions came together in 1918 to 20. It's a very interesting book, but you can look at the stuff he wrote in the 1930s, the 1940s, the 1950s, down to his death in 1980, and you could trace a line of how gradually it changed and moved back to what he'd started at the start of his career in the 1930s. Yola.
But you must remember that we cannot exclude history, academic life from, generally speaking, political content.
Yeah.
We were the funniest barrack in this camp. Please remember, so we have Catholic Church, we have a lot of, social society, we have intellectuals, so in fact, we have completely different conditions despite all those restrictions. We have completely different condition environment. It was intellectual life, in fact. And of course, we were under the regime, but I think that generally speaking, we are much more free. We have a very broad scope of free choice, in fact, to some extent. And it is very difficult to compare with Russian, scholars, in fact. And we should, as Robert said, we should, really appreciate their efforts, because it was for them much more difficult.
Yes.
And I think also that Marxism, my daughter studies in the United Kingdom, and she also studied in France. Marxism is still alive. In the United Kingdom, university is very popular. In French universities, very popular. It is a little bit different Marxism as it used to be.
They didn't experience.
Different experience. However, it is still, Marxist explanations.
Yes, I remember on the point of the constraints that scholars were on working in Russia, when I was in Krakow in the must have been the mid-1980s, and I went to the history department, and Józef Jarowski had just come back from examining a doctoral dissertation in Kiev. And the doctoral dissertation was on the September campaign of 1939. And he came back and he was regaling, he said, the student had written nothing about the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. And he said, so what did you do? He said, I passed the thesis, how could I not? He was not allowed to write about it, so how could I fail him? And that was what it was like. I was just, when I was preparing for this evening, I looked on the web, as you do these days, and there was a discussion about, there's apparently an article about the September campaign which doesn't mention the Soviet invasion. And yes, I've seen it. It's in one of the, I can't remember whether it's Kwartalnik or Przegląd Historyczny from the 1950s. And there's this wonderful map of Poland in 1939, which somehow to the east of Warsaw just fades out to nothing. You think, how could you write an article about, I'm a military historian in part, how could you write an article about a military campaign which omits to mention that the Soviet army comes in at the same time? Now, that was why nobody wanted to study modern history in Poland. Nobody at all, because there you did have the constraints that you had in the Soviet Union. Now, we've not answered half of your questions, so I can't. What haven't we
It was
answered?
as much a comment as it was a question.
Sorry,
about nationalism, about history and the impact of nationalism or history as an escape for national sentiment.
Yeah, well, that was part of the point of what I was saying about the history of the Union. One of the reasons I'm interested in the history of the Union is that nationalist interpretations cannot explain it. Why would somebody create a union that lasted 409 years, which is only this year has the Anglo-Scottish Union surpassed the Polish-Lithuanian Union, and next year we have a referendum which might end it. And I will point out that the Polish-Lithuanian Union was ended without the consent of its citizens in 1795. So there you go. You can't explain that union if you look at it through nationalist terms. If you talk about national sovereignty, Witold is defending Lithuania's national sovereignty in 1429. No, he's not. He's defending Vytautas' interests.
Right.
No, that's what he's doing.
And here, in spite he collaborated with Tectonic Nights.
Well, sort of, up to a point. You also
must
beat them.
remember that there is a completely different, definition of nation, because we can consider and we can understand the union in terms of political nation, not nation in its 19th century, means. So I think that it's completely different. However, I think that as far as I remember, my modern history courses ended with, as far as I remember, in 1945. 1945.
Oh, what a surprise.
1945. So never mind.
John?
Mine in 1988.
No, you're a younger generation,
Yeah.
Karen.
Yeah.
I'm just curious to ask about how much of the experience of that 123-year period informed the historical background, approach, awareness of Polish historians after World War II. Because if you take it in balance, Poland had only been independent for 20 years or so, and really, the bulk of Polish experience in the past 150 years was not being free. So how much of that was a benefit? How much of it was...
I mean, the whole partition period, I think, was crucial because Polish identity changed radically in that period. Half of the people who turned out to be Polish in 1918 would never have thought of themselves. I mean, and they go, well, they spoke Polish. Well, I speak English, but it doesn't make me an Englishman. I'm a Scot. The fact that the Polish language was spoken across the Szlachta throughout the Commonwealth from the late 16th century didn't mean that people, the Union produced a national poet of 3 separate countries. Mickiewicz is a national poet of Belarus, of Lithuania, and of Poland. He never visited what was modern Poland apart from 2 weeks in Poznan in 1848. All his statues stand in cities that he never visited. If you ask Mickiewicz what he was, well, he says it in the first line of the poem. I'm a Lithuanian, I'm not Polish. The centers of Polish culture in the 1830s, that was Vilnius, not Warsaw or Krakow. And suddenly, in the late 19th century, people who regarded themselves as Lithuanians were suddenly told that they were Polish. Were they? Well, yes, in the circumstances, when Woodrow Wilson came up with the brilliant idea that nations should, there should be national self-determination in the First World War. He didn't come up with the idea, but he trumpeted the idea that national self-determination was a disaster for Eastern Europe. What was a nation? If your mother was Polish, if your father was Ukrainian, your grandfather was Russian, what are you? Norman Davis once told me a wonderful story. He said national identity in the 20th century was determined by your age, because he found a case of a Silesian family. The elder son was born in 1920, so he was 18 in 1938. He was called up into the Polish army. He fought in the September campaign, and because he had perfect German, he was very useful in the Armia Krajowa during the war. And at the end of the war, he became president of the local section of the Armia Krajowa Society in Poland when it was allowed, and that was fine. His younger brother was born in 1921, so he was called up into the Wehrmacht in 1940. He fought throughout the whole campaign, and after the Second World War, he ended up in Bonn or Munich or somewhere, and he was president of the local association of the Vertriebener-Verbände. Same family, 2 brothers. What was national identity in Eastern Europe? And to come back to your question about borderlines, that is what is emerging. Poland, Lithuania, Ukraine, unfortunately it's not allowed in Belarus anymore, the last Soviet state in the world apart from North Korea, are gradually coming to terms with what happened in the 19th century and are starting to escape from that, because of course the partitioning powers encouraged all of this. Look what the Austrians did in Galicia. Look what the Russians did. Look what the Prussians did. They encouraged this stuff. That wonderful remark about, who made that wonderful remark about Chodkiewicz, I can't remember the list, but there's a list of Lithuanians. Chodkiewicz, Piłsudski, these are Litvini, a wy Lietuvice. You know, suddenly, what's that? Yeah, my first research student's a Lithuanian, Artūras Vasiliauskas, who now runs the British Council in Vilnius. He learned Polish from his grandparents, who lived in Kernavė, and who in 1918 realized they were on the Lithuanian side of the border, so they said, okay, we're going to speak Lithuanian in Poland. So they did. And his mother speaks hysterical Polish, because it's mixed with Russian, all the rest, because she never learned Polish properly. But Artūras learned Polish from his grandmother. And Vasiliauskas, when he came to Warsaw to do his archival research, I deliberately set him up with his opiekun, Professor Tadeusz Wasilewski, born in Vilnius. Yeah. That heritage is coming back, and people are beginning to be able, at last, not after 123 years, but after 200 years, to confront it, to argue. That's why, actually, early modern history is still very interesting, because it's dealing with these problems.
Yeah, I have a question. I come from the perspective of being, a layman, not an academic, but I follow history in Eastern Europe a lot. It's interesting to me. I'm wondering to what extent, one would like to think that history always matters. Historians would think that, I would imagine. But I'm wondering to what extent historians from Belarus and Lithuania and Poland and Russia talking with each other about the Confederation period, the Commonwealth period, if there's any currency, any current effect for what's going on now, especially I'm thinking in terms of perhaps Ukraine not wanting to join the European Union, maybe looking west as opposed to east. Is there any current effect or any current relevancy from that? Or is it really unrelated?
Well, Carol can talk about Ukraine. I mean, there are still a lot of ghosts that need to be laid to rest. Poland and Lithuania fought a war in the 20th century. People actually had to decide and make these terrible decisions that split families apart, that divided regions and districts, the one from the other.
So about modern history is very, very difficult.
It is extremely difficult.
Extremely difficult because of this this genocide in the Volhynian region in 1943. Yes, so there's completely different points of view. But if we talk about the Commonwealth, it's easier. It's easier, of course. I have a few colleagues, only women. Yeah, only women. 3 women. So, 3 historians. There's the school of Natalia Kowenko.
Excellent historian.
Yes, excellent historian. Who is so. This school wanted to collaborate with Polish, and they tried to see something positive in Commonwealth, because of course it was period very important in Ukraine history because this of time of colonization. Yeah, so there's many Ukrainian towns were created in the beginning of 17th century. But of course, mainstream in Ukrainian history is, as you can see, Cossackology. So of course they focus on Cossack mythology and Cossack legend, because of course Cossack were free warriors for them that created, that started the modern national consciousness for Ukrainians. It is this only problem that we treat Cossacks in Polish. The Polish historians treat Cossacks differently, yeah. But of course, some historians, Polish historians, understood Ukrainians' reproach because of course because the Cossack legend is very, how to say,
Romantic.
it's very romantic. Yeah, it's a good good answer. Also for Poles, yeah. but many Ukrainian historians started to talk about Ukrainian nobility. That also they used Ukrainian language. This is the approach I am deeply interested.
What's really, bother us as historians that sometimes, politicians, try to provide their historical policy, so it can influence very much.
Okay.
And sometimes I think that they can make a mess, in fact. But generally speaking, we try to be as much as possible open towards their awareness. I think so, because they are very sensitive to some problems, and we try to to be very empathetic. So and I think that it helps. And also we have very good relations with Natalia Yakovenko, and also with some other historians from Lithuania. But I'm also a member of a board, scientific board of Polish of Museum of Polish History, and we have a special scholarship fund, and we promote young scholars from, generally speaking, foreign scholars, but it's mainly oriented towards Eastern, from ex-Soviet countries, also Ukrainians, Lithuanians, so on, who want to study, to do research in Polish archives. So we have special funds, and we can promote it, and it is a very, very good idea, because in fact, when these young scholars come to us, they can, attend our seminars, they can attend our lectures, they can, exchange ideas, so to somehow it foster this, it facilitate the process of, real cooperation without any negative sentiments and so on. And I think this is the best idea.
And the borders are now set. Nobody is actually suggesting that we revise the borders. That
No.
possibly Stalin's only positive contribution to world history was that he set the borders, and nobody's seriously thinking in Germany about retaking the western borderlands. Nobody in Poland, I think, is seriously thinking about retaking Lviv. That's gone. That's the past. We know the trauma and the dreadful things that happened in the 20th century, but we're now in the 21st century, and that has helped, I think, a great deal. And it's a very exciting period to be involved in the history of that part of the world. For the first time in generations, we're free to produce and research without those constraints, except in Belarus.
We have now been working. Our colleague Igor has been working on the joint project Polish German history, and it will be completed by 2014. But it is now impossible to do the same with Ukrainians and Belarusians and so on. So in fact, it requires time.
Well, the German-Polish textbook commission, which has been meeting for years to sort out how textbooks on Polish and German history are written in each country, has been a huge success, because historians have got down and sat and said, how do we deal with these traumatic incidents from our common past and present them sensibly to school children, so that we can escape the thought, that Grunwald, Tannenberg nonsense on both sides. And that has been immensely positive. And we need that in the East as well. It's more difficult there, but it will come, I think.
In time. Let's take one more question, and then, I'm so sorry, did you want to say something? Or okay, Michaela, and then we'll break.
Thank you. I was wondering whether you could talk a little bit more, maybe both from the British and the Polish side, about the exchanges of East-West scholars during the communist time. And then now I'm thinking not only about the actual research and the constraints, but I'm more thinking about the interactions you had with scholars on the other side of the Iron Curtain. I'm thinking about conferences you attended. I'm thinking about other scholarly exchanges that actually took place across the East-West divide.
Well, it was actually relative, if you were studying that period, not 20th century, it was relatively easy as a research student to get to Poland to do your work. In fact, the Polish government gave me a scholarship to do it, which was very nice of them. And I experienced no problems whatsoever in the archives. Nobody said you can't look at this, nobody said you can't look at that. They thought it rather odd that somebody should come from Scotland to study 17th century Polish history, but they were very pleased. And I never had any difficulties at all. There were Polish scholars who did get out to the West, often because they had made the necessary compromises with the party. Didn't mean that they believed in what the party was doing, but to live in Poland, all of us in PRL, all of us had to make compromises. I mean, I kept my distance from anything political. I didn't want to get involved in Solidarity because I knew if you get chucked out of Poland, then that's your career gone. So, I made that selfish decision. I'm interested in what Solidarity are doing, but I'm not going to get involved because I can't afford to. And people who lived there made the same compromises, and some got passports to travel to the West, and it depended if they had the languages, and there were various Polish scholars who were often in the West. The first Polish historian I met was Antoni Manczak, who was a great historian, who regularly came to the West because he could speak excellent English and he could speak excellent German. And so he turned out. I fundamentally disagreed with his ideas on political history of the Commonwealth, although his economic history I think is brilliant. So we used to turn up at conferences and he would say something and I would say, Professor Manczak, I disagree. But that was terrific, but others didn't get out. In 1980, when my thesis was examined in London, Norman Davis had a brilliant idea of entrusting it to the British Foreign Office so that it would get to Warsaw quicker. And after 9 months, we wrote to Zbigniew Wójcik, who was the external examiner, have you got this thesis yet? And he said no, because of course we couldn't contact the West easily. And so we worked out the British Foreign Office must have sent it to Warsaw, Alabama, or wherever it is. I don't know. So somewhere, if there's, where are the Warsaw in
Texas. Texas
it is. Well, probably in Warsaw, Texas. There's a copy of my thesis sitting in the used post office. But Wójcik was allowed to come out. Now, he was from a family and of a background that was not, he'd never got a passport before, but they allowed him in 1980 to come to London, where he could visit for the first time the grave of his father, who's buried in London because he had fought with the Polish forces in Britain in the Second World War, which was quite moving. He said, I'd never seen my father's grave before. But that was it. Some scholars got out, some scholars didn't, but I never saw any real problems on people who were interested in early modern history. It was a different matter with the modern stuff. That was an entirely different question. And at that point in the PRL, I think a lot of scholars in Poland made contact with scholars in Germany, in America, and in Britain and France that subsequently blossomed after communism fell. But Jola, you...
No, not so easy, as you thought. And I don't agree also with Manczak because he has a very special position at the university. Yes. He wasn't an average scholar, so he was, he had a concession to go, as for example, Andrzej Garlicki has. Andrzej Garlicki was the only one who could go to the Piłsudski Institute, and he was accepted.
I said they made the necessary compromises.
Yeah, and he was also a very special person in this, party establishment. So it wasn't so easy, but now it's so. I think that always it was relatively easy for foreign students and foreign scholars to come to Poland. I think because we are really always proud if someone can speak as Robert, for example, we are very proud of him because he speaks Polish fluently and he knows our history very, very well, sometimes even better than many Poles, I think so. I think so. So I am I am really happy that Robert could organize this conference, which is to start tomorrow evening, and he, and Polish-Lithuanian Union was the pretext to invite a lot of very famous scholars from Georgetown, Paris, and so on, so on. So I am really grateful that in such a, prestigious circle, we will talk also about Mazovia, Polish-Lithuania, and so on, so on, so on. So it was relatively easy for foreign scholars to go to Poland and to have free access to our archives.
Unless they
so.
worked on the communist period.
Yeah, of course. But now it is mainly the problem of having grant now, because now it's relatively easy to go somewhere west, but you should have a grant, and this is a problem. But I think that is the same problem in the West, because you have to apply. Your application must be good, and you have to be competitive. In fact,
There was one hysterical occasion when I got a grant to come to Poland, and this showed you just how completely dysfunctional communism was. I arrived in Warsaw for a month, and I went to Manchak, could actually sponsor me, and I went to Manchak to see Manchak, and I went down to the little office in Warsaw University where foreigners were dealt with to ask about the grant I was to receive. And they said, "Oh, but you will not be paid your grant in advance. You'll be paid at the end." And I said, "Well, that's useless." I said, "I'm here for a month, and I receive my Polish zlotys the day I leave." Brilliant.
it was the same situation when I visited Notre Dame University.
I recommend we break into more informal discussions.
I think that's
Thank our panelists.
Oh,
I'm sorry.
Thanks to the fact that Poles readily accepted foreign students, Norman Davis landed in Poland and not in Russia because the Russians wouldn't let him
They
come
wouldn't
in.
let him in. He was followed everywhere he went at first.
That's right. Yeah, a lot of us experience it.
Yeah.
We're never alone.
Yeah.
So thanks to that, we have wonderful books about Poland.
Norman had a way of getting into places he shouldn't have done, because of course he wrote about
He wrote about
the Polish-Soviet War,
Yeah,
which
exactly.
was really off limits.
Right.
He did it by pretending to do something else.
That's got to be a story in and of itself. I invite you all to imbibe. We thank our panelists. We all had to have a story.
It was, I think he said he was going to be working on British-Polish diplomatic relations. Of course he did.
Putting it on the record somehow.
That's right, you had to say that.
Oh, sir, that's not of interest to you.
Oh, yeah, that's
Well, yeah. It was